on the record. If any of you have a brief comment to make, and I mean brief before we start, please feel free to do so. And can I ask?
Yeah, my name is Tony Meggs. I'm the Chief Executive of the Infrastructure and Projects Authority in government, which reports to the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. Our job is to improve the way that projects and infrastructure is delivered in government, and we oversee all of the government's largest infrastructure and other types of projects. And I'm very happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Anne Bentley. I'm a global director of a company called Levett, Bucknall. We're project managers, cost consultants and building surveyors working both in the UK and internationally. I also sit on the Construction Leadership Council, who we effectively provide advice to government on construction matters. And I have a particular interest from the CLC's point of view in procurement and productivity.
Good afternoon. I'm Matin, Chown. I'm the Supply Chain Director at Sellafield, a large complex nuclear site in the north of the UK. I'm here also because I sit on the Infrastructure Clients Group, and I'm here to answer any questions you have based on the Infrastructure Clients Group. We sit together as some of the largest infrastructure providers in the UK to join forces and collaborate on where we can collaborate and make the industry better.
Well, thank you very much indeed. If I might kick off first, in a lot of evidence we heard now, virtually all of the evidence we heard now, there's a great deal of enthusiasm for more off-site construction, for more projects to be done in off-site construction. But we also identified some possible barriers, and we like your views about these barriers and how you think they might be overcome. One is that the business models in the construction sector needs to change. Another is that the companies in the construction sector need to be more collaborative in lots of areas, including in skills development. And thirdly, that there is a cash flow and financing in the sector which needs to change compared to other international construction companies where financing is managed better. So those are the three key barriers that we have identified that need to be overcome if you're going to get more off-site construction. So who'd like to start?
Well, I'm happy to kick things off, if I may. So the barriers that you refer to, I think, are becoming reasonably well known. I think just to sort of supplement that a bit, we have a track record, I think, in the industry and working with government of procuring for lowest cost rather than for best value. And I think that has driven a set of behaviours in the industry which are not very collaborative, where we try and move risk down the value chain. The second area is one of aggregation. So in order for this type of technology to take hold, we need multiple projects and longer time horizons. And the industry currently largely runs on the basis of individual projects where the incremental costs of off-site, upfront costs of off-site manufacturing cannot always be justified. So I think we need to move to a more collaborative approach, an approach where more risk is shared, and an approach within government where we can look at multiple projects over multiple years and aggregate demand, potential demand for off-site construction in a way that's really not done at the moment.
How do you bring about more collaboration amongst companies?
Yes, please.
So, as part of the Infrastructure Clients Group, one of the things that we've developed is a new model for construction, which is called Project 13. And we launched that in early May, although it's been around for a while in development with lots and lots of companies, lots of people contributing to what Project 13 could be. Essentially, it's a change to how we can go to market and how we can procure on a more collaborative basis right from the start of the need for construction. So to establish the need for what's required for the infrastructure and then come up with better models as clients to drive that collaboration within the supply chain. So setting ourselves out very clearly as the owner and what we want from the asset and how we want the asset to perform over its life cycle, how the supply chain can be constructed, and as Tony said, how to do that over multiple projects. So many of the ways that we're looking to work in Project 13 around the clients around the table is that we come up with models where suppliers can work on many projects, both large and smaller, and they can go from one project building on that success from one to another. That, we feel, enables innovation, enables productivity, and enables that knowledge to be built in from one to the other. And it takes time to be able to do that. That kind of long-term arrangement that we're building through Project 13 and in our own organisations around the table in the Infrastructure Clients Group, I feel is the key to driving that collaboration in the supply chain. And it also takes into account the third area that you said about cash flow and risk and reward, because it has to be based on payment for performance and profit for performance based on those outcomes. So that's the model that we're advocating as part of Project 13, as the Infrastructure Clients Group, and many of the people around the table are driving that model forward in their own organisations.
Okay.
Could I say, going back to your first part of your question about business models, I think that there are already very many business models out there, and it's very dependent on which sector of the market you're actually operating in. So the house building model is very different to the commercial development model, which is very different to the infrastructure model. So I think that's quite important to begin with. And in fact, in some of these models, there are already quite significant amounts of off-site construction. In fact, I would say in the commercial model, something like 80% of all components brought to site have some level of off-site manufacture to them already. So I think that's quite an important sort of point to make. But from if you like, a construction advisor's point of view, the biggest challenge that we have in promoting off-site construction is actually the need for competition. And many of the funders that are funding the construction work that we work on, so whether that's private sector or whether that's in the public sector with public funding, have very, very high levels of scrutiny in terms of how you actually let the contract. Did you go out to market? Did you get competitive bids? How is this placed in the marketplace? And one of the demands of the off-site model is that you get to a point of freezing your design very early in the process, and so you are actually quite limited in terms of the number of contractors particularly you can go to. And we find that a lot of our private sector clients are loath to commit to a single contractor very early in the process and actually want us to continue with the design development until they can get to a point where they can go to market.
Okay. Lord Fox.
Well, you alluded to the different reaction in different sectors. Would you say that commercial is more potential, has more potential for this than home building? And would you say public sector versus private sector? Which of those two sectors? Where should we perhaps target effort?
So I would say that it's more value-based than necessarily sector-based. So I think it's really the point that Martin was saying, that if you have got a programme of projects or a single project that's probably worth in excess of £50 million, then you can pretty much say whatever type of construction you like. And it's big enough that somebody could either set up the process to it or could make it standardised or whatever. So that could be 51 million pound projects or one 50 million pound project. But if you're looking at one £1 million project, then there's nothing standard about it, and so it's very difficult for anybody to then advocate.
And 50 million is an illustration, or is that actually...
It's an illustration, but it's a sort of order of magnitude. It's not 10 million. It's a sort of order of magnitude that it's worth the market reacting to the procurement type, if you like.
If I could just contribute. I think it is value across many, many sectors, in fact all sectors. The approach is different. But I've seen successful off-site manufacturing in student accommodation. And again, there's a repeatability to the schemes. So sometimes the schemes are larger or smaller, but essentially they're the same. It's converting a disused office building or a new build into quality student accommodation with modular bathrooms and those type of things. And there's been 30 or 40 of those schemes that I was been involved in with my previous employer. And the benefit from that doesn't come in scheme 1, 2 or 3, but kind of 7, 8, 9 and onwards, when you really see the benefit and the cost coming back for the off-site manufacture. Again, in highways and in rail infrastructure, there's parts of the gantries, a part of the control systems that can be manufactured off-site successfully, and bridges and those type of structures can all be considered for off-site manufacturing. And in my sector that I'm in at the moment, large infrastructure buildings, and interestingly our classification of a major project is indeed over £50 million. And there we've used off-site manufacturer to build large, heavy, even 500-ton off-site installations that we've then inserted into a large process building. So I've seen different approaches that have been more or less successful over smaller, low-cost builds, right the way up to £700 million plus projects. But the approach is different, and the lead time to benefit is different for each of those projects in each of the sectors, but none of them are immediate.
Lord Griffiths.
If I can just clarify my own mind, your answer to the question regarding competition.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that if we were to move to greater use of off-site manufacture, a more collaborative approach with shared risk, there would inevitably be a reduction of competition?
No, I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying it's perceived to be that. And I think that is actually the crux of the issue.
Right.
That many of the clients that we work for believe that the only way that we can demonstrate competition is by having a competitive tender on a completed design, if I'm honest. And I'm not saying that's all clients, but that's many clients believe that that is how you ensure best value. I advocate almost the complete opposite, actually. I think you will get better value and you will still get competition if you go to the market much earlier in the process, because you'll get much greater buildability, you'll get much greater input from the actual people that are going to build it. But the perception is often not like that. And I would go, and we talk about the sort of the knowledgeable or the educated or the, you know, the sort of competent client, if you like. And I would say that one-off clients are even more likely to say that. So if you have a client that procures lots of things a lot of the time, then clearly they're expert clients and they understand this. Single one-off clients tend to go, no, I just want it tendered and see what turns up.
Lord Renfrew.
Thank you. What actions do you think are needed from the government, perhaps through the Construction Leadership Council and from the construction sector, to help increase the use of off-site manufacture? It was disappointing, I think, that the government didn't give a full detail of the sector deal when it made its announcement in the Industrial Strategy White Paper 6 months ago. So there was a press release which spoke of objectives, reducing cost, reducing time, reducing greenhouse gas, reduction in the trade gap. But what do you feel that the sector deal needs to contain to meet these objectives?
Can I start? I mean, talking more widely, a little bit more widely than just the sector deal, I think there are 4 sort of key things that are necessary or that will be very helpful. One is more research and development, and that is a part of the sector deal. And you know, that is research and development around sort of manufacturing techniques as applied to building. Second, as Anne referred to, really is better practices in procurement, a more collaborative approach, much more collaborative work together up front. And this is something that we are pursuing partly through Project 13 and through our own in-government initiative, Transforming Infrastructure Performance. This third area where I think we can play a real role is aggregation of demand. So again, as the others have said, if you just have one-off projects, it's very difficult to justify the upfront investment of time and money to use really modern methods of construction. But if you can aggregate demand, as we can in government by looking across different departments, then you can much better demonstrate the benefits of this approach. So that is why we have included this so-called presumption in favour in five government departments. That means that they will first and foremost look to using modern construction methods, off-site construction methods, along with other routes, but with a preference for that, provided that it stacks up. And finally, down the road, the development of a sort of library of standardized components. Not to make it sound too much like Lego, but we can see lots of opportunity for developing various platforms, which will allow many different types of buildings and things to be constructed from a base number of components. And we in government are planning to work on that over time.
Thank you. You mentioned Project 13, which I've been reading, and I'm not quite sure of its status. It's clearly very well intentioned. It has almost a piety about it. But who exactly is it directed towards?
Well, I'm going to let Martin.
I can answer that. So Project 13 is directed towards infrastructure clients within the UK. There were 300 people of 140 organisations that contributed to Project 13, including many...
Why is it Project 13? Sorry to interrupt, but just the title is striking, but
yes,
why is it called
I'm afraid
Project
the
13?
answer's painstakingly dull. It was the 13th project that we led out of the ICG group.
Fair enough.
Yes. And I was curious myself, so that's why I've asked the question. But yes, it just was the 13th project that we started. The reason that Project 13 and the reason that we developed it and the reason that it's important for off-site manufacturing and indeed other methods of productivity is basically there's four reasons, which I'll briefly cover if I can. It provides the scope to drive the efficiency in the supply chain investment, so we add in scope through Project 13 for multiple projects, as I described in the earlier answer. It builds on longer-term relationships, so longer-term relationships are part of it, and with those longer-term relationships there's investment in that advanced manufacturing methods and the products that are required. It has integration at its centre, so we integrate the suppliers together and they're able to compete within it, but not with an open competition in the way that Anne described, so they're part of the delivery of the outcome. And the fourth one is there's an earlier strategic engagement of the suppliers, so that they're there. And one of the features that we've found with off-site manufacturer and other production methods is it's not taking what we do on-site and simply moving it off-site. It's looking at this right from the inception so that things are designed to be manufactured off-site. So there's a marginal benefit by moving things off-site in safety, which is important, of course. But really the best benefits we can get is through designing things to be made off-site and then build the efficiencies as things arrive on site. Project 13 launched on the 1st of May. And we have 3 pilot projects that are running with Project 13 now. We already have the next 3 that are running, but the principles of it are already embedded in most of the large infrastructure clients. There's 25 large infrastructure clients in the UK already embedding the principles.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lord Hunt and the Lord Mayor.
In this committee, we've been learning about what I call the Griffiths conundrum as to where the Treasury is, or Alice in Wonderland, is the Treasury on the outside as the funder, or are they on the inside as it were, trying to move it? And the Treasury is, like in this document here, it's hardly mentioned, because we don't know what it's doing. But I sort of wonder, is there a central government? How is the central government push, as it were, happening to this project and the whole business of introducing these new methods?
Could I address that? I mean, as somebody who works at least partly for the Treasury, we report curiously to both the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. And so in a sense we are helping the Treasury. I mean, the Treasury clearly at the end of the day is interested in value for money, It's also interested in productivity, therefore it actually has a very keen interest in what we're trying to achieve. We have I hesitate to call it an initiative, but it is an initiative within the IPA called Transforming Infrastructure Performance. It has 4 components. One is about benchmarking to make sure that we're competitive. The second is about integrated development to make sure that houses and trains and so on are built in a coordinated fashion. The third is about procurement, better methods of procurement. And the fourth is to do with both with technology, and that is use of digital technology, BIM, as you've no doubt heard about, and modern methods of construction. So these are the 4 axes that we are pushing on behalf of central government. We work with lots of department and with industry. So all of the things that we're doing are lined up with, current industry, most advanced industry thinking. And, within that big program, we've got lots of effort underway. Again, building on an industry desire to do things differently. Such as, for example, we've set up a working group that works across several departments. So share best practice on modern methods of construction, and again, possibly, hopefully, to aggregate demand. There's a lot that we can do, but we have set up a team within our organisation to help drive this forward for government, with government as one of the biggest clients, or no, the biggest client for infrastructure in the country.
Lord Mayor and Lord Baron Morgan.
Can I follow up on that point?
Yes.
You made a very good point earlier about the aggregation of demand. And you mentioned the presumption in favour
Yes.
that the government has talked about
Yes.
for the 5 departments, providing that there's best value for money. And I guess that's a very important proviso.
It's an important proviso.
Can you say a bit more, though, about this presumption in favour? I mean, what does it actually amount to? I mean, we have potentially 5 government departments. What would the presumption in favour actually mean in terms of really pushing forward this agenda?
Well, I think that it's obviously an excellent question. What it means is that we will work with all those departments, and all of those departments working together through the working group that I've discussed, to make sure that in the evaluation phase early on, as you know, with all government projects, we require people to develop various options, so that the best option can be chosen. And in that option selection process, we will require those departments, or those departments have committed to having at least one of those options as using off-site, substantial use of off-site, and I really mean modern methods of construction, more advanced approaches. Then I think our job, as a practical matter, will be to help with that evaluation. And what I mean by that is where we can see the benefits of the wider, as it were, societal benefits, or the wider benefits of looking at a larger portfolio. We will introduce that into the considerations to make sure that those evaluations are done in a way that is forward-looking. So just to try and clarify that, one project on its own often cannot justify the necessary investment. A group of projects can, and I think that by using this presumption and the aggregation of demand across those departments, we'll be able to, as it were, amortize the investments over a larger pool of activity.
And you use the phrase "require the departments to have at least one of the options
Yes.
offered to them
Yeah.
involving off-site manufacture." How would that requirement work in practice?
Well, yet to be seen. I mean, in fairness, all of those departments have used various forms of off-site manufacturing already. Yeah. So this would not be, as it were, earth-shattering. I think what will be different on this occasion is that we will be looking for, really sort of more advanced methods, not just a few bits of off-site, but looking at the entire manufacturing chain. And I think that we will undoubtedly work with those departments. We will work with those departments to make sure that they've considered the most up-to-date technology approach, that they have all the learnings from across the industry and from other departments and other places where it's worked. I'm clearly not doing a very good job of describing the anatomical details of this, but it is about collaboration. And I think that commitment is a meaningful thing. I mean, it sends a signal to industry, I believe, that we're serious here. And the departments, we didn't twist their arms. They made these commitments of their own volition.
And just to follow that point, are you saying that they would in effect be held to account that if they did not consider off-site manufacture, there would be some sort of question asked as to
all of these projects have to get funding approval from the Treasury, and so as a part of that approval process, they will be required to have done a thorough evaluation of off-site and modern methods of construction. And if they haven't, then working with our friends and colleagues in the Treasury, we'll ask them to have another go.
Could I just add to that? I think the key to that question is, where does the wider social value sit? Mm-hmm. So I am pretty sure that anybody, with a calculator could make the argument either way, for either off-site or conventional, depending on what it is you're actually really measuring. So if you're absolutely measuring unit cost at point of supply, then traditional construction methods may well come out cheaper. But if you're then adding in long-term value, you're adding in quality, you're adding in local employment, you're adding in health and safety, and lots of other slightly less tangible, they're not intangible because they can all be measured, but they're not quite as in your face, then it becomes a much more complex matrix. And that's the question that I think the Treasury has to be asked. It's not which is cheaper, A or B, because, as I said, any one of us and anyone in the room could make A or B possibly cheaper depending on which one of these factors you come in. It's which of the factors are actually most important.
I was going to say, so just to be clear, are we to understand that the Treasury don't ask any of those questions as part of their enthusiasm for the presumption that there will be off-site manufacture?
Well, I wouldn't like to cast any aspersions whatsoever on the Treasury, and I don't think it's been a kind of major theme in the Treasury so far.
So, but then this presumption for as we hear about, is slightly meaningless, isn't it?
Well, no, this is a new. This is a new. We haven't had any kind of cases through the Treasury since this, as it were, since this presumption was introduced.
Now, I think your response has excited quite a lot of the committee members, so I'm going to suggest that they ask very brief questions and please brief answers before we move on to the next question. I got Barrister Morgan's done with. Lord Valence.
The Treasury will understand the concept of externalities, and I think, Ms. Bentley, you were talking about externalities. One of the biggest ones in their objectives from in this sector is a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the built environment by 2025. That's huge. And surely, in terms of assessing the procurement of a government deal, that at least should be quantified and part of it.
So my answer as a construction advisor is absolutely yes, it should be. If your question is it always, then the answer is not always.
Lord Fox.
Yeah, well, this is kind of, as I started to get agitated, moved in this direction, because it seems to me that we're looking at the wrong end of the telescope here. We shouldn't be worrying about how we build. In essence, it's what we build and the quality of what we build. So it should be, if we were to exert higher standards for on-site waste, on-site construction safety, the safety and quality and the environmental performance of the final building, would that not be a better way of driving better building technique, one of which would be off-site manufacture?
It would be an equally good way. I would say that
equal to what?
To factory produced. I mean, one of the things about
that's essentially what I'm saying, is that if you put higher standards in, then you would inevitably drive the industry towards
to a common
more collaboration, yes, and more. So in a sense, I'm asking for support or otherwise for a standards-based approach to creating the changes in all the other changes that we're discussing, in a sense.
Again, from my perspective, both on the CLC and as a construction advisor, absolutely. I mean, I think at the moment there are examples both in the private and public sector of very poor quality design, poor quality construction, poor quality procurement, but they're cheap.
If I could just comment. So I think the Infrastructure Clients Group and in fact the Institute of Civil Engineers has a role to play. And I think as well as standards and as well as Treasury involvement, which is always welcome about advising us about how we can proceed in the best cost-effective way, we have a role of driving it forward for ourselves. And we have a self-motivation to save the taxpayers' money and to deliver the best value that we can. And a recent example of that is we recently built a store in our facility in Cumbria. And previously we would have designed that store, tried to build it and built it successfully. It would have taken time and money and cost and whatever. We looked at the industry around and we found that someone else had built an almost identical store, slightly different size but similar very much in concept. We built the same store, or they're almost identical, slightly larger. We optimised it, used exactly standard industry materials directly from the industry. We didn't specify them, we just used industry standard direct from the factories. The store came in about £10 million cheaper and a year early, which is a really strong achievement for us to be able to use other clients' work and copy that for the benefit of what we're trying to do. If as the Infrastructure Clients Group and the Institute of Civil Engineers we can promote that kind of work from the ground up, roll that out through Project 13, we'll get a lot of traction. And so support for me for Project 13 and how we want to do things can be client-driven, both in the public sector and in the private sector, as well as being driven out of Treasury or Cabinet Office or out of Tony's organisation.
Very brief question, Baroness Young, and then I'm going to move on to Lord Hunt.
The presumption, how's it going to be measured? Because it seems to me that the method of measuring the success of the presumption determines what's going to be taken into account, as it were. Is there a clarity about how it's going to be measured?
I think it's quite honestly too early in this process to be specific about that. But I will measure it in terms of actually how many projects adopt modern methods of construction. And I wouldn't expect it to be universal, but I would expect it to increase over time. We haven't at this stage set any targets as such, because again, I think it's too early in what is for us a new initiative in government.
Lord Hunt.
So, what actions are needed from clients to help increase the use of off-site manufacture? When we went to this factory where they were making off-site equipment a couple of weeks ago, and they told us the story, which is the opposite of your story. They told us the story of building all these schools in Yorkshire using off-site methods, and then the next round of bidding and so on, they were not chosen, and for reasons that were completely unclear, and that was sort of an example of not going. And one wonders really, how can clients be educated and informed about the potential benefits of using off-site manufacture? And that's I imagine the sort of area where the Treasury might sort of have a look at that, on some bigger scale. But it was a palpable example, and that was clearly very disheartening for a company that had made these big investments.
So if I may start just to try and answer your question. I believe that one and some others have been, to Anne's point, have been recompeted, so that they've built some knowledge and they've been recompeted. So what clients could do is to look at their needs over a longer period of time and to understand that off-site manufacture does require that repeatability and that long-term nature to it, and that benefits will not always come in school, perhaps 1, 2 or 3, but definitely will come in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and beyond. And so going to market with the procurement model that is cognizant of what you want to achieve over the longer term and building in the scope for where you want to go, and then allowing that long-term relationship to build and develop without having to constantly compete or recompete, as I believe happened in the Yorkshire Schools model, is for me the way to go. So clients can understand their requirements, require an off-site manufacturing plan, use the principles of Project 13, but to me, very early in the days, that comes into the market-facing structure. Procurement colleagues, and I sit in that world myself, need to be very careful about what we can achieve over the longer term, as opposed to perhaps going to market every year or every 2 years to try and recompete and try and save some money.
I would say that I think that Crown Commercial Services have a really big part to play on this, because a lot of public procurement, particularly not so much in the infrastructure side, but more in the residential or sort of smaller facilities education side, is done through Crown Commercial Services. And historically, there were hundreds and hundreds of different frameworks. So you could have a framework for police stations, you could have a framework for schools in Lancashire, you could have a framework for this, that and the other. And each one would be subject to a serious competition. What Crown Commercial Services are now doing is really trying to actually combine a lot of these frameworks into some much meatier national frameworks. Now, each framework will then probably have quite a lot of suppliers on it, because they're not trying to get rid of competition. What they're trying to do is really, on Tony's point, aggregate the market. So once you know that you're a supplier on that framework, and that is maybe 5 years, possibly an extension to 7 years, then you can start an investment program, because you actually know that you're one of the framework suppliers. You might not know exactly which schools or which hospitals, etc. you're going to build, but you'll know that as you're on that framework, you're in with a pretty good shot of getting a percentage of that work. And I think that in terms of what government as a client body can do, that piece of work that Crown Commercial Services is doing is a very significant piece of work indeed, because they're broadening the framework and they're extending it, which means it will be far more attractive to sort of these economies of scale.
May I just make a couple of points? I mean, one is, I think the government has, over the last few years, done quite a good job in terms of increasing the length of the... so, for example, in highways, you know, it used to be a sort of annual thing, and now... annual plan, as it were, and now we have 5-year plans, similarly in rail and so on. And I think that's really opened up the opportunity for longer-term, more collaborative relationships. That's point number one. The second point is a different point, and I think goes to part of your question, which is really, I think, part of our job over the next few years is to improve kind of the understanding of the economics here. Right now, if you look at all of the evidence, as I think as Anne said, you can kind of come up with any answer you want to in terms of whether this is a good idea or not. And I think we need to build the evidence base and get much clearer about the not just the societal benefits, but the actual economic benefits of taking a long-term manufacturing approach. Fundamentally, this is about improving productivity, but it's going to take quite a long time for those benefits to be, I think, clarified.
Okay, Bernice Morgan.
I mean, that was one question, actually, which in a sense is about pace. To what extent? I mean, how directive are you being? I'm thinking about Mr. Meggs really, in terms of, for example, setting out that there should be a move towards value rather than initial capital cost. I mean, to what extent is that being driven through the system, or is it a more discursive, working groupy approach? Because I mean, it seems to me, I mean, time is somewhat of the essence on this in terms of driving productivity, and we haven't even talked about the domestic housing market and the urgency to try and drive productivity there.
Well, I have been asked this question several times. I think that in some areas we have taken quite a directive approach. So, for example, in the use of BIM, which is an enabling technology for this, we have taken the approach of, of mandating it. And even with mandation, or even making it mandatory, it takes several years for it to actually spread through the industry. So we started that in about 2011 or 2012, and it's achieved real momentum now. I think in this case, I realise it feels a bit fluffy, but we are not in a position to mandate this right now. First of all, because it's not always the right thing to do, and secondly, actually, the industry capacity doesn't exist. Thirdly, because the right sets of standards are not in place to make this a sort of ubiquitous technology. So there's a lot to do in terms of both improving understanding, in terms of doing research, in terms of setting standards that needs to be done over the next few years. We have a sense of urgency. The industry, I think, has a sense of urgency, but it's a very, very large, complex and amorphous industry that... I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of goodwill here and there's a lot of desire to move this forward, and I wouldn't like to come in with big, heavy boots and turn it from something that people want to do into something that people are forced to do. Not yet, anyway.
Just taking your value question, which was, I think, at the heart of the question, I would say that the people that are being most successful on that are the infrastructure clients, actually. And these are the people that have got longer-term funding arrangements. In a
sense, they're driven to, they're more open to doing it.
Yeah, because they've got longer-term funding, but they are also asset owners. And so they also directly see the benefit of the cost saving. So if it's a long-term cost saving rather than a short-term cost saving, clearly if Highways England or Sellafield or somebody see that they spend an extra couple of quid but it saves them £100 a year forever, they have the ability to do that. In single projects, that's much more difficult.
So why can't that be... Sorry, why can't that then be understood by housing associations? Who, in a way, you could argue have also got they've got the long-term relationships. Or how do we make that?
Okay, this is now opinion. This is I'm not speaking from anywhere. I think that if there was a move to really make or desire housing associations to do that, then I think Homes England have quite a strong role that they could play in that. I think one of the issues with housing associations is that they still have their own design standards, they still have their own procurement standards, and these aren't necessarily bad things because they address local markets. But if you want national economies of scale, you might have to accept you have to give some of that up.
Okay, just a quick question from Lord Fox, then I'm going to move on to Lord Valens.
Just a point of clarification. I thought I heard Mr. Meggs say that we couldn't move it. You didn't want to force the issue on value assessment or value judgment on this because there wasn't the capacity in the industry to do that. But it seems to me you don't need off-site manufacture to still be forcing the point that we should be looking at the value rather than the point cost of a development. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I may have misspoke or misled. I didn't really mean. What I meant was I don't think we should be forcing at this stage off-site construction or modern methods of construction.
It was off-site, not value.
Absolutely forcing the whole life value considerations.
Okay, Lord Valens.
Not much of the evidence we've taken so far has been about buildings, one kind or other, small, big, but it's vertical. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the horizontal. Does that offer the same sort of scope for off-site manufacture? Are there different characteristics here? Is it easier or more difficult to aggregate schemes of this kind? Perhaps.
If I could start. There are different challenges, certainly, in the vertical sector of infrastructure, and there have been some notable successes in off-site manufacture and standardisation across the metro tram linkage in Manchester where they had 52 platforms, and most of that work was standardised across the platforms, and most of the features were standardised across the platforms. Canary Wharf Crossrail Station had the whole platform, which was manufactured off-site and dropped into situ. So a number of areas. Heathrow's looking extensively off-site manufacturing, where they could do that, and actually driving economic growth in different areas for part of that off-site manufacture. And Highways did a lot of work about standardising their gantries that sit across all the motorways. So where there's standard features that can be applied for multiple schemes, I believe there's a very strong case for vertical infrastructure for off-site manufacture, and the cost benefit for that, I think, is starting to develop, and some of the case studies are quite strong. I think where you're starting to put things into the ground and you've got more of an interface with what you're doing and the ground geometry and all of those type of things become more variable and more difficult for off-site manufacture. But where features can be established, and different size of features for modular construction and all of those type of things, there's a very strong case for building advanced manufacturing techniques that are both off-site and on-site for the linear infrastructure.
Is the industry structure the same, or is it more integrated than perhaps on the vertical side?
I think most of the clients that I interface with on the infrastructure clients group are very like-minded. For those of us that are building large structures or doing highways or rail, we've looked at each other's models, and actually we share similarities in terms of long-term goals. So our thinking and our desires and our collaboration and our incentive models are developing in the same type of ways, which suits the drive for off-site manufacturing.
So there's not the same drive to pass the parcel of risk from one element to the other, is it? Okay.
So the risk models that we've set out there's different risk models that have been used, but in Project 13 we advocate a risk sharing as opposed to a risk transfer, and we believe that driving an outcome where both parties are cognizant of the risk, and you drive through the project to mitigate and diminish that risk, and there's profit to be had on achieving better outcomes, is the best way.
Just sort of to answer that slightly differently. I mean, I think the industry is quite disaggregated, both vertically and horizontally, in all sectors, quite frankly. In answer to part of your question, and certainly from a government's perspective, our historical approach, not universally, but a lot of the time, has been to move as much risk down the chain and away from the government as possible. And there's lots of good reasons for that, like not wanting to be on the front page of the Daily Mail, etc. But it doesn't necessarily produce the right outcome. So, I think it's a very substantial cultural shift for the government to embrace a more innovative approach where collaboration with the supply chain can produce better outcomes for all, better outcomes for the suppliers in terms of their own commercial outcomes, and better outcomes for the client. That's the basis of Project 13. But it's a non-trivial thing if you are used to living in a world where your job is to parcel off as much, is to get rid of as much risk as possible.
But you don't see any really distinctive differences between the horizontal and the vertical?
Well, I suppose for me, I'm talking about the sort of social infrastructure sectors versus the economic infrastructure sectors. Not really.
I mean, I would say that I see a difference in the way that risk is handled, and I would say that the majority of the large infrastructure clients have a much better understanding, no, maybe not understanding, a much better acceptance of the concept of risk sharing than many of the commercial clients. And a lot of the commercial clients' attitude to risk is pushed by their funders. So if you're borrowing all of the money, then clearly the funders have a very different view to risk and the return on their investment than perhaps if you're building any number of railways or whatever, and perhaps you have a longer time to distribute the risk over. And so we certainly see a difference more in where the money's come from rather than what is being built.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay. Bernice Morgan.
Can I just ask you about skills and the workforce? I mean, obviously we know, even in the current construction sector with traditional methods, if you like. We know there's a shortage of skills. We know the skill that it's ageing, and we know with Brexit it's going to get more difficult. So, taking that as a sort of starting point, to what extent do you see the need for a completely new set of skills for the new world, if you like, and how do you see that being developed? Is it developed alongside, or can we retrain people? I mean, just paint a picture, if you will, on the skills side.
I mean, my take on it is I think if we go to really significant elements of offsite as opposed to a few percentage elements offsite, and also I think there's a big point about, is it UK manufactured offsite or is it overseas manufactured offsite? So if I go back to my commercial building example, where once you're out of the ground, probably 70 or 80% of it is already manufactured offsite in truth, but not necessarily in the UK.
Right.
So you have an issue of where the skill base is and what the skill base is. But certainly I would suggest from evidence and I'm now talking about commercial buildings and residential buildings, the training needed to get an off-site operative in a manufacturing facility up to a very, very high level of competence is months, not years. Because the very nature of the manufacturing process is that it's repetitive, it has a degree of quality control built into it. So you need some very clever people to set it up. Mm-hmm. But once it's running, it's something that is relatively easy to train over a relatively short period of time. The site operatives, I mean, clearly you will still have a need for site operatives and they will still need general site training. But certainly a lot of the main contractors are now talking about multi-skilled operatives, so people that can actually do many trades on site rather than just do a single one. And I think that is a retraining program to some extent. I mean, clearly you're going to bring new people in, but you're going to have to retrain some of your existing people.
Okay, thank you.
If I may build on that, I mean, I agree entirely with that. I don't see it, however, as a wholesale, we've got to get rid of all of these and do all of that, because it's a huge industry and there will still be lots and lots of conventional work and there's quite a big rate of attrition. So there's tons of opportunity for new people to come in with new skills, some of whom will come from other sectors, manufacturing and digital skills in particular.
Okay. Lord Hunt.
I'll just ask, I just run the Met Office, and it was interesting when we had a big project. We were told by Ministry of Defence, use the techniques we've got, and you just use them. No looking at all sorts of possibilities. They did it, done it cheaply, and they howled to have to do it so cheaply as the big department did. So in other words, this is very different from the Treasury's view, which would be very touchy, would be very dodgy about this. But a big government spending department. But presumably the government spending department deals with Sellafield. They can get really big projects done in which there's a benefit from each one. Isn't that the sort of one of the ways of sort of brute force, Whitehall brute force, can, as it were, get some big projects done without worrying too much about the finesse of the procedures?
Could I? I don't think anybody I don't think I would describe the Treasury in any way as sort of fluffy or touchy-feely.
You should see them anyway.
Not the words that come to mind. It may be my problem rather than theirs. But again, the presumption in favour is designed to encourage departments, and they, have agreed to use these methods wherever possible. But I think to force these methods on every project in a kind of uniform way would not produce the best outcomes. So I think we're in a learning period here, and we will understand over time, as we have with the BIM process, what progress is being made and whether more forceful measures are required.
Lord Vallet.
Yes, we're talking about workforce skills here, but what about procurement skills? Do they need to be developed, particularly in the public sector? And what about client skills in their understanding of these different methods?
Yeah.
How do we get around that?
Well, we've got two of the world's best procurement experts sitting here. But let me tell you two things. One is Doing procurement the way that we would like it to be done, and including off-site manufacturing and other things, does require sophisticated players. I think the government is moving very strongly in that direction. There's been a big program over the last 3 or 4 years to bring in a lot of new procurement capacity and capability into government. So we're moving in the right direction. We've still got a long way to go. And of course, we do have people like, Matin, a very leading procurement expert procuring on Sellafield. Very complex procurement that he's got underway right now.
Lord Foxton, sorry.
Yeah.
Lord Foxton, then I'll move on to Baroness Young.
For a different reason, I had a meeting with David Liddington, and we were talking through the organisation that comes underneath John Manzoni, and we were told that there is an extensive process of procurement training going on. So, is this on the curriculum of that training?
Could I just take, perhaps answer your question in a slightly different way? So earlier someone mentioned the industrial strategy and the construction sector deal. And one of the key components of the construction sector deal is an element called procuring for value. Now it is, I agree with, I can't remember who said, but someone said it's a shame it hasn't been published yet. It is a real shame it hasn't. It's been written. It is a real shame it hasn't been published yet, because there is, the answers to some of your questions would come out of that document. So procuring for value is very much recognised by the Construction Leadership Council, by the IPA, by the Infrastructure Clients Group, by pretty much everybody in the industry as being a fundamental tenet of moving this stuff forward. And certainly part of that is that both the advisors and the clients need to be properly trained in it, because if they're not, it's just words on a bit of paper. And I think in different ways we're all trying to move that forward, but certainly if you have any influence in that area, it would be much appreciated.
But in answer to your question, government commercial services is driving forward an extensive reskilling of procurement staff across the whole of government, and that's being led from the top, and the whole commerciality of how colleagues in procurement work and whether they're capable of delivering the right outcomes for the department and how they do that is being managed extensively. It's a large and extensive programme, and if people aren't of the requisite standards to go forward in that programme, then they won't be put into those commercial roles to be able to do it. So it is a very comprehensive programme. It has all the right principles behind it to make sure the government commercial function across all of the departments is a lot stronger than it has been in the past, and it's been driven very hard.
Baroness Young.
I was going to talk about R&D, but I want to ask you a prior question, and that is, from your insight, why has the sector deal not been published? What's the flaw that's holding it up?
I honestly, I don't know that. I mean, it was written in principle, as I said, by Christmas. I know that the Carillion failure had an influence, but that was months ago, so I don't know.
Well, we'll test that with the Minister in due course, but you go on to your question.
Oh, you spoil all my fun, Chairman. R&D, I mean, the construction sector traditionally has invested a hugely small amount, if you'll pardon the expression, compared with some of the sectors in which we really lead, like automotive and aerospace. No doubt this is going to be addressed, I hope, by the sector deal, but how do you think we could get more money into R&D, and what are the areas that need more money in R&D in the construction sector?
Well, I think the unpublished sector deal does seek to address this. I mean, it is a government injection of 170.
But that's still pretty small scale. If you look
it
at
is pretty small scale,
aerospace.
but it's when combined with the industry contribution, it's more than doubling what's currently there. And I think we would waste money if we put vast amounts of money. It has to be something that the industry can co-invest in, and they're not, rich at the moment, if I could put it that way. One of the reasons there's been low levels of investment has been because of the very thin margins. So it's a substantial increase, and I think it would be wrong to sort of multiply it by 10 over a very short period of time.
And what would you see as the priorities?
Well, I think the priorities are, to some extent, there's about standards and standardization, and to some extent it is about introducing, manufacturing techniques going all the way from digital models through to components within a factory, as is done in, aerospace and automotive area. That's just not commonly done in the UK in the construction sector. Thirdly, I think there are materials the developments that could be done. But first and foremost, I think it's to enhance the manufacturing process, if I could put it that way, or turn construction, or at least parts of construction, into a genuine manufacturing process rather than just building things off-site. And I think there's quite a big difference there. Well, if I may just say this, as sort of, I actually think that there is an opportunity here to sort of improve the taxonomy a bit. When we talk about off-site construction, we mean many, many different things. And rather like we have BIM, sort of level 1, level 2, level 3, I think, sorry, this is just me musing here, but I think we need to develop a clearer taxonomy. Off-site construction is very widely used. I mean, at some level, a brick is a piece of off-site construction. And actually, we mean different things. And what I'm really talking about, ultimately, is the ability to take three-dimensional electronic designs, as it were, and turn them into products that can be fitted together in many, many different ways. And that is, I would call that, I don't know what to call it, level 5 off-site construction. Sorry, that was a...
That's very helpful, thank you.
I actually think it would be helpful to introduce some real taxonomy here, to clarify.
Just answering your question in a slightly different way, I think that if we have a limited R&D budget, we should spend more on the D and less on the R. I think that one of the issues that the UK construction industry really struggles with is actually best practice. So again, using Martin's example of simply going to the market and saying, well, where was a similar one built? Can we just copy it or use somebody else's IP? We are terrible at that. So if you go out to the construction sector, you will find brilliant examples of absolutely brilliant technology or operations or offsite or whatever it is. I could find you a brilliant example of it. But our ability to share those examples is actually quite poor. And so I mean, I'm not saying we don't need research. Of course you need research. You have to keep up with the rest of the world. But actually what we need to do is ensure that the research we've already done is spread fairly widely across the sector so that people have access to the good practice and good results.
Okay. Well, Lord Mayor.
Last point. Follow that. Where would you say the UK sits in relation to the rest of the world in terms of off-site manufacture?
I mean, it's sector-driven. There's no two ways about that. So in certain sectors, I mean, so again, talking about the commercial sector, I would say we're the same as the rest. I mean, we're as advanced as anybody. I would say that in the high-rise residential sector, we're actually quite advanced. I would say that in the low-rise residential sector, we're substantially behind Scandinavia, North America and Japan.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for helping us with this. It's been most interesting hearing you. And thank you indeed. We're off the record now, right?
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
This inquiry, you are our star performer today, so we're looking for all the answers to you. Before we start,
do my best.
Can I say that all the questions are addressed to you, Minister, but you decide whether you are going to answer or you want Mr. Harrington to answer. Okay.
Well, Lord Patel, I've always disapproved of ministers that bring officials with them to select committees, but such is Fergus's speciality in this particular sector. I thought it may be a good idea if I did bring an official with me, just in case you had any additional questions. But I will not be ducking out of them myself.
Okay, thank you. We normally do not allow ministers to be accompanied, but for the very reason you mentioned this time, we made a concession.
Thank you.
Okay. So before, we know all of you, both of you, but before we start, just for the record, if you don't mind saying your name and we get it on the record, both of you, and then we move on to questions. If you want to make any opening statement, please feel free to do so, Minister.
Thank you. My name is Richard Harrington. I am Minister at BEIS with responsibility for business and industry.
And I'm Fergus Harrington. I'm the Deputy Director for Construction within BEIS.
Thank you. Do you wish to say any opening statement, Minister? Or?
If it's acceptable, Lord Patel, I'd like to go straight on to questions.
Very good.
Happy to expand, of course.
Very good. I think you'll get plenty of questions, so
I'm sure.
Don't worry about that. So if I might kick off first, and it's in connection with how the government and what policies it might enact to improve or increase the use of off-site constructions. In this respect, I like your comments as to how you think it might be done, and my questions are, do you think the Leadership Council may have a role to play in it? Or is it that it will be all mapped out whenever we get it, and you might tell us when we might get it, the construction sector deal?
Well, happy to, if I may divide the question to first thing about the Construction Leadership Council, which it sounds, the title sounds rather stuffier as an organisation than it actually is, because it has a very clear strategy to push on-site construction to off-site construction, which is, I think the Americans would even call that a mission statement. So its very existence, a core part of it, is to promote construction in in factories for reasons of cost, for reasons of the environment, really. They're the two things. And it's independent of the department, although I co-chair it. Traditionally, with these councils, there's a minister and there's basically a leader, elected leader from industry itself. I've not been to one yet because I only took on this responsibility for construction quite recently. There's one in the first week in July, which I'll be co-chairing. But BAYS, the department, provides the service itself, the administration and everything, but it is an independent council. So leading from that, in terms of your question, how else can the government influence it? Well, one of the main things is we have this fund of £170 million, which we call Transforming Construction Programme, which is precisely to transform I nearly said corruption, excuse me, construction from the traditional, well, what we would all accept as building site type of construction, with all of the skills, or shortage of skills as there often are, the price of which has gone up dramatically. I mean, in the years when I first got involved in construction myself, when I was 23, in business, the price of it's hugely outstripped inflation. I'm a little out of touch now because I've not been in business for 10 years, but even in my time it went up from about £40 per square foot to about £200, £250 per square foot in some more complicated central London sites. That's because of the cost of materials, the cost of labour, and all of the on-costs, many of which were improvements, by the way, to do with health and safety and this kind of thing. So I think the policy of the government is there's so many reasons why it should be moved to basically factory-based construction, which, by the way, is not new. Many buildings structures that we're familiar with, for example, I believe Paddington Station was predominantly built in factories. This is not new. It's been going on for many, more than 100 years. People will remember that after the Second World War, this huge construction of prefabricated houses were all built in factories. So this isn't new. But of course, it's the technology that's changing. And because, half of my department's budget, this is not widely known, although it's public, but half of BAYS' budget goes for research and development one way or the other. Incidentally, the other half goes for nuclear decommissioning, which is spoken about even less. But of the budget that goes through all the different funds, Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, etc., things like the Transforming Construction Programme, they're all research and development based. And I think that is the government's key role, apart from the direct involvement of government contracts, which perhaps I could come on to in a moment.
In responding to government contracts, you might address the issue of contracting for value rather than capital costs.
Yes, I can do, happily. Should I perhaps mention the sector deal, which you brought up first,
Yes,
Lord
yes,
Farrell,
please.
if that's acceptable? As members, I'm sure, are aware, sector deals are an important part of our industrial strategy. They are intended to get, how can I describe it, to get a lot of different companies and stakeholders involved with government. It's kind of moved from, in different generations, where the feeling was that government should be directly involved in industry in the way that civil servants would literally, and ministers, talk about taking stakes in businesses and this kind of thing. In my childhood, I remember visiting when I was doing A-level economics, the NEDC, as it was called, Development Council, which was very much, it was very impressive to us sixth formers, but basically it was a room full of people deciding what stakes in businesses to take, with politicians actually interfering, usually for political reasons. And I promise I'm not making any party political point. It's still how it's decided in a lot of parts of the world. It moved from that to a general belief that government couldn't really get involved in industry because the market itself would decide. Well, I think that was particularly discredited as well. The industrial strategy, it's not the first industrial strategy that governments have had in their history, but it is based on this partnership. So government puts money where it thinks it will add value, not invest in individual businesses. And research and development is typically part of it. So the sector deal, to get on to the relevant point here, is a deal between the sector, broadly speaking, which is usually, we try and make it not just the big companies, but it's through different organisations, in construction, the council, nuclear industry association. I could go through all the different sectors, which hopefully represent the whole of industry and government. And it's typically an arrangement whereby each side, it's a clear offering. In government will do this if industry does that. Now, construction is one of the first ones. It was hoped to be one of the first ones that to come about. We've actually, it is in the first batch of them, and it's taken longer than people originally thought. I think that's fair to say, Lord Patel. And I'll just, if I could explain why. Because in the first instance, most industries do not have people trained to write a sector deal. I mean, maybe they should, I don't know. Some got through it by basically hiring very expensive and very competent people to do it. For example, Sir John Bell, who chaired up the Life Sciences one, and Peter Bazalgette, who did the Creative Industries one. But many industries don't quite have that level of access to people that are used to the way that governments work. Well, that takes longer. We've got officials that help, because obviously we help them do it because we want them to do it. But it was no prizes for being first at all. It's not a race like that. That was one reason. Secondly, the industry itself had to decide what it wanted particularly. So usually there are a combination of skills, a deal for skills. Well, construction's a lot more complex than most because, well, first of all, it's got its own methods of recruiting apprentices and everything, which it always has, some of which work and some of which don't. There's some fundamental problems on skills, in so much that contracts tend to last for shorter periods than apprenticeships, etc. So there's things like that. How should government be involved in what we're here to talk about today?
So when do you think it might be published?
Well, I'm going to tell you a civil service word, which I think I'll probably get into trouble, but if I said imminently, I hope that would be acceptable to the committee.
We were just told by previous witnesses that they thought it was finished at Christmas.
Well, it may be finished as in the draft and everything was finished, but it has to go, have to go through all of the different, I'm afraid, all of the different departments and approvals and write rounds and everything. But it's my job to get them through, and I'm very happy with the construction one. And by imminently, I mean, well, if I was, I think the press say you're hauled before committees, so I could do with a good hauling if it's not imminently, and I would willingly accept it.
Will it be at the next session of the Parliament?
Oh, I would hope it would be in this session of Parliament, Lord Patel. I'm not.
Presumably you discussed it at the committee. You're going to be there in July.
We've discussed. Yes, I in fact had a weekly meeting with how these deals are going on with the officials, what we need, what the industry have said, etc. But if there's been a disappointment in the time period, I don't apologise for it. What I apologise for is if members of the industry perhaps thought it was an easier process than it has been.
Yes.
But I hope it's worth waiting for. It's not just. I mean, anyone can organise a drinks, reception and drinks party and a press release. Departments are full of people that do that. And I think it would be, to me, there is much more than that, because it has to be something that's delivered that means something.
So whenever it comes out, is really full of information. Baroness Neville-Jones.
Minister, could you say how the 170 million figure was arrived at and what it was going to be spent on?
Yeah. I'd like to ask Fergus on that one, because I don't know. I don't want to just waffle, and he knows the specific answer.
Right. We put in a bid as the construction sector for a sum of money to the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which is a competitive fund that's run by Innovate UK, which is now part of Innovation and Research UK. The original bid was slightly higher than the 170 million, but that was the figure that was arrived at following an internal Innovate UK analysis of the bid and what they decided to fund, taking account of the fact that they do already fund certain activities in this area as well. So they have regular calls for innovation funding which are relevant to the built environment. So this is new and additional funding for the industry on top of what they would already have expected to have got from within the core budget of
So what's it going to be spent on?
What's it going to be spent on? 70 million of it is going to be spent on what we call the Core Innovation Hub, which is to be a centre which will take forward the development and commercialisation of digital and off-site manufacturing technologies. Around about another £30 million is going to be invested in what we call an active building centre, which is essentially a centre that is going to develop technologies that will enable buildings to be energy self-sufficient or ideally energy positive. So it's about energy generation storage technologies for the built environment. And then the remainder, which will be about £70 million, will be awarded via various competitions, and it will support R&D projects and demonstration projects linked
so are these first two that you mentioned, are they going to be new organisations then? How are
no,
they
they're
going
likely
to
to
be
be consortia of existing organisations in the case of the Core Innovation Hub, and the Active Building Centre is likely to be established within a university, probably within an existing research group.
It's going to be new. Is the other one going to be industry then? Or?
Yes. The other one, it was a requirement of the competition that the Core Innovation Hub consortia be led by a research and technology organisation.
So there is actually an evolved programme.
An evolving programme, I would say. We've planned some of it, but there are further steps to go until we've finally defined it. It will be implemented over a 4-year period.
I'm just going to ask you, so it's a 4-year period, right.
Okay, Baroness Young and then Lord Fox.
And in addition to the government 170 million, is there money pledged by the sector to match that?
You continue.
Yes, the Innovate UK estimate is that the government's £170 million will leverage around 250 million of matched funding from the industry through their contribution to funding R&D projects where under state aid rules we can fund a maximum of 50%, or through activities that they choose to fund in the centres that we're going to be setting up.
That's an estimate, is it? Right?
That's an estimate at this stage, yes.
I see.
Okay. Lord Fox.
Slightly struggling with the phrase Core Innovation Hub, so perhaps if you, is that going to work like a catapult, so you've got companies coming in and trying stuff there, or is it going to be generating its own stuff? So how do you envision this thing?
It will essentially work in a similar way to a catapult centre, but it's going to be a consortium of different institutions with slightly different specialisms, taking account of the fact that there isn't a single institution within the UK that has all of the expertise that we think we are going to need to develop.
And the governance of that will then work through Innovate UK, or how?
The funding will be managed through Innovate UK, and obviously the consortium that wins the competition will have various performance metrics against which they will be assessed in terms of delivering the outputs.
Assessed by whom?
But quite how it's going to be governed is for the consortium to decide. The competition is still open. They're putting in a bid which we're going to be assessing within the next few weeks. So I'm afraid I can't give you any details.
So the we is Bayes here, or whom is the we who's doing the assessment?
It's overseen by Innovate UK. There's a panel of people with various expertise.
Which I believe that you are involved in.
I personally am one of a number of assessors who will be involved.
I was trying to work out which of your hats we were.
So
it's the Innovate UK hat in this particular case.
Well, they're inside and outside experts on the panel.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Lord Griffiths.
Minister, Chancellor said that 5 government departments are going to adopt, quotes, a presumption in favour of modern methods of construction, including off-site, next year. When I first read the expression a presumption in favour, I felt it could have been lifted from a script of Yes Minister, because it means almost anything.
It probably
and
was.
I'm sure,
Lord Griffiths, it probably was. But that doesn't mean that it's
can I say, I'm sure that's not in your mind, Minister.
No, quite the opposite.
Exactly. And you have a very practical understanding of what that means. And if we could ask you to spell out what the practical understanding is, because certainly when I worked in Number 10, I found cooperation between 2 government departments was difficult. To get to 5, I don't know if the Treasury is one of them. If you add the Treasury as well, that's a very complex thing to do.
Actually, the Treasury is not directly involved in this. Let me just explain first of all which departments. And I, as a person who has not had the pleasure of working at Number 10, as you and Baroness Morgan have, but have been even involved... yes, and well, I meant Lord Griffiths and Baroness Morgan. I can't speak for other members. Well, Baroness Neville-Jones has worked in buildings adjacent to number 10, I know. But I
sounds sinister.
I share. Well, she should answer that herself. But I can't really comment on that. But this is I take it as I find it as an organisation, as a way of doing it, which I also was inherently cynical about, based on my experience in the outside world rather than within government. So it's the Department for Transport, Department of Health, Department for Education, Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Defence. These are the five which
education.
I would have... Yes, so these are the departments where there is a mass of government expenditure on buildings, basically. The Treasury are always there, of course, because they fund everything.
It's luck.
Yes, well, yes, the Treasuries generally regard all the other departments as mere back offices for the Treasury, don't they? But in this case, there's a working group which includes us as a department and external people as well. And the presumption in favour, which actually I thought, well, this doesn't really mean very much, but it means that they've pledged that from next year, from 2019, well, I think in about a year's time, the five departments have a presumption to build that every built assets that they get contracted, there's a presumption in favour of it being made in a factory rather than on the building site in the traditional way, which doesn't bind them in terms of absolutely, because some buildings just would not be suited for it. But many are, it's possible. So, for example, this is nothing to do with public expenditure, but for example, most of these large supermarkets are built in factories now. I saw, to my amazement, in my own constituency in Watford, a Morrison's supermarket built in 16 weeks, which I observed because I was asked to do the footings when they give you a spade which you then put in your office, and people say, what's that? But it literally was like every morning, these huge walls would appear. Yeah. But it was finished on the day it was supposed to do. So I can imagine that for buildings like schools, etc., it's quite possible for them to fit into that panel. So I think it is very achievable. The scepticism I may have is that, as you say, it's the sort of thing that sounds quite good to talk about, and I'm sure nobody enters into it and thinks we're not going to do this, we're going to try and stop it being done. But in practice, there are factors pulling away. For example, local planning, where councillors and officers might have a completely different view. Budgetary constraints, that comes back to the point that, in fact, I didn't answer Lord Patel's question, I think it was Lord Patel's question on the lifetime of an asset thing, which we moved on, but he did ask the question. But if I could answer it in this context. So, again, is the presumption that everyone has exactly the same type of building made in a factory, which might be good to get the cost of construction down, but is that better for the lifetime of an asset? And again, lifetime of an asset is absolutely great in theory. In practice, it might not be, because budgets are to try and get the price down because the Treasury are there saying, that's your ceiling. The Green Book in the public sector, it says best value, it defines best value over long term. It's done that for many years. This has nothing to do with this government. Well, that means usually, is it worth spending more in the construction phase if you can benefit from that in terms of lower costs of running a building, which of course for all these public buildings are equally as important to the exchequer one way or the other.
Can I just follow up by asking, to what extent do you think you need to ensure that these five departments have the right resources and the right skills and so on to do this? And are they in any way then accountable to you, that you yourself or with other ministers and so on say, I'm terribly sorry for, say, the Department of Transport, just to take an example, you really, you've been very lax in interpreting presumption in favour and so on, and we're just not happy, and we'll have to change things.
That will be done through this cross-governmental working group, which is called, it's just basically one of the, I forget what it's called, but it's one of the cross-governmental working groups, which is there to make sure that it happens. And monitor it and to make sure that it happens. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, with my construction and general bays hat and responsible for industrial strategy implementation, everything, I have asked for and will receive reports on a, I hope, regular basis. Well, I've asked for them, setting a system up when this gets going in a year's time, really to monitor this, because I'm a great believer that sometimes people start with the best intentions, but there's always reasons why it can't be done. Well, it can't be done until the following year. It can't be done for the following year. As has been implied, the Chancellor made a very strong statement about it at the budget, or I think it was the autumn statement of 2017, only not long ago. And the Chancellor's also behind it, maybe for reasons which are not quite to do with improving the construction industry, but because it's financially it makes a lot of sense. Even if it were traditional construction, not off-site construction, it would still make a lot of sense to do. But it's more than in the wind, this. It's a real policy, and it's my intention to make sure that it is implemented properly. And I've asked specifically for, if there is any department does have a problem, that we discuss these openly at the beginning, so that it's not something that's said a year later when it hasn't happened.
Okay, thank you. Baroness Neville-Jones and then Lord Mayor.
Thank you.
Minister, you didn't mention, I think, 5 departments, DCLG, is that right?
DCLG are not in. I said it from memory. Would I be correct? They're not in.
The reason I asked the question is, I do wonder how these departments, even if they've got the skills, have the power. We paid a visit to Lang O'Rourke, who are indeed, invested very heavily in this, and they told us a story which bears on what I'm on this question. Part of Yorkshire, I don't know which part of Yorkshire, had commissioned some schools, and these schools were built. Lang O'Rourke invested very considerably in the whole business of designing the schools. And after the first delivery, they then had, in a sense, a template for more schools, at a unit cost, which presumably would have been profitable for them. So what happened the next time round? Yorkshire reverted to traditional procurement. So there was no follow-through. My question to you is, how are you going to ensure, sitting in London with central departments, that actually the bodies that are going to commission these buildings, I mean, whether it's NHS England or the local authority, I mean, local hospitals or schools, that actually this message gets through, and that the good intention of the central government actually is realised.
I wasn't on the visit, but my understanding of how that would work as well is that the capital actually for that would come from the DFE, not from Yorkshire. So how are we in a situation that the capital is going from the DFE and Yorkshire are deciding they're doing something different with the money?
Well,
you may have to go away and look at that, but it's just. But I mean, that's symptomatic of some of the challenges.
I'm afraid I don't know that particular example, but at the end of the day, I think, as Baroness Morgan says, he who pays the piper calls the tune, and the government will have such things happen. The government will have to stipulate that.
And you really are going to do that?
I'm familiar with Lang O'Rourke. I've met Tony O'Rourke, and they do a lot. They're very big scale, very competent people, and there must have been a reason for Yorkshire to change its mind.
Well, they didn't. They hadn't. It wasn't divulged to them.
No. Well,
put it that way.
I couldn't comment on it because I don't know. But if it were cheaper and if it were just as good, why would they? I think you and I should declare an interest, Baroness Neville-Jones, as from Leodensians ourselves.
But the general point, I think, Minister, is that you are going actually to use the influence and the power of the central government.
We're going to have to. So I'm trying in my sectors to continue mentioning it. For example, I've asked for a meeting with Sir Edward Lister, who's Chairman of Homes England, and explaining this point, and that we would expect, even if I don't actually have the direct power to do it, that we would expect, and we will be viewing all of Homes England's work, which is all over England, through the prism of off-site construction, because it's within our industrial strategy and because it's this 5-department presumption. And I think we just have to keep banging away at it.
So presumption means exerting quite a lot of downward pressure.
I think so. And if my own personal pressure is not enough, which I have to say it probably isn't, but if it's repeated, and if it's repeated by people such as the Chancellor, etc., and if the Treasury start making this conditional, which will be very much in their interest to do so because of the cost, despite the fact it's in all of our interest to do with industrial strategy and all the other reasons that we know, I think in the end that will make authorities like the one in Yorkshire decide to comply. If there isn't a cost difference, or they can show that it isn't as it appears, and that's why I don't particularly want to criticise them without knowing the because I don't believe their reasoning would be completely illogical and irrational. And without impugning Lang O'Rourke or any other company for that matter, sometimes companies do see things just from one way themselves.
Sure. Lord Mayor.
Minister, in the previous session we heard from Tony Meggs of the Infrastructure Projects Authority on this issue about presumption in favour.
Yeah.
Where he expressed a view that the 5 departments from 2019 would be expected to say in the procurement process that they would want to see at least one off-site manufacture option. I mean, what's your comment on that?
Well, I would hope that it's more than that, but that would be part of a presumption in favour. But of course, for the people promoting and managing a project, there may be reasons why it's not suitable. That's why we couldn't just make it completely compulsory for all projects to be constructed off-site. But the more we push, and in the end the government's a big procurer, it can't do it as directly as perhaps it would have done in different generations, because that was shown for other reasons not to be a very efficient way of doing it. But in the end it can stipulate these matters, subject to cases where it's just not appropriate to do so. So for example, I can see with taking housing, for example, I can see that a very small development of different types of units for different kinds of use, for example, different types of sheltered housing, things like that, I could probably see where that wouldn't be as appropriate. But for many other cases, it would be, well, the presumption is this is going to be built. It's on a large scale, it's exactly the type of modular unit that can be done according to a central design, which is much cheaper and much more efficient to use. I've observed quite a lot of it, and I've seen in my own constituency, there's the BRE in Garston, which used to be a building research establishment, where they've been researching this kind of thing for quite a long time, these different materials and everything. And it's now the time. It's now the time with the different types of computer design and all the other things. And I really think we're on the cusp of it. But the government's got to push it by pushing the government procurement contract.
Okay, Lord Valence, a quick one, then I moved on to Lord Fox.
Can I push you just a little bit further
Please.
on procurement? In your introductory statement, you said there were really 2 types of benefit from off-site manufacture, one of which was cost and the other was the environmental benefits. Now, when you were doing your A-level economics, I no doubt that you picked up things about externalities. And of course, the economics of improvements in the environment are very much to do with the externalities. One of which was announced when the sector plan was announced, or before it was published, but when it was announced, was to reduce greenhouse gases in the built environment by some 50% by 2025. Now that's quantifiable. Do you think that externalities of that sort should be quantified in government procurement in the same way as costs? And if not, why not?
First of all, maybe the reason I did not get the top grade in economics because I did not understand what externalities are. But as far as I think government is precisely what government can stipulate in procurement contracts, and so many things now government do stipulate in a way that wouldn't have been dreamt about it only 10 or 20 years ago. And again, government has to stipulate these things if it is to achieve targets which are perfectly proper targets to do with the environment. So I would say absolutely yes.
So there are armies of economists who will give you the cost of carbon, So I think what you were saying is that the cost of carbon should be included in government procurement of infrastructure of this kind.
Because the government's got an overall carbon target, and it's one of the ways of achieving it.
Great, thank you.
There are armies of economists who obviously say completely to the contrary, but governments have to decide.
Thank you very much.
In the United States as well as here.
Baroness Young, if it's a quick one, I need to move on.
One of our previous witnesses also said that as yet there hadn't been a set of performance criteria set for the presumption. You know, is that going to happen? And have you any ideas about what they might contain? Because they could in themselves be quite effective
Could
drivers.
be short yes or no answer.
Yeah.
There aren't a set at the moment. It would certainly be something that we could consider doing as we develop and work out what the presumption means in practice.
Because a simple one of simply more off-site construction is kind of rather bald. There are other things like capturing externalities. And
well, I think in relation to off-site construction, what we would want to do is capture as comprehensively as possible all of the evidence that we can about the benefits, whether that's in terms of reducing carbon emissions, reduced time taken to complete jobs, reduced error rates, reduced waste produced, taking account of the fact that the construction sector accounts for about 60% of all UK waste, and not least of all the cost of construction. So we have done some work on this in relation to specific subsectors, and there's some good case studies of the benefits of off-site construction in relation to a range of built assets, but we haven't done it comprehensively across the board.
Lord Mayor, did you have a quick...
No, Chairman.
Okay. Lord Fox.
Turning really to the construction sector, we've heard countless witnesses tell us that it's fragmented, that cooperation is difficult, and particularly when you start to move into private sector contracts rather than the ones that you've just been talking about, it's very difficult to drive the sort of behaviours that you've been describing. So how can government involve itself in encouraging? And we just heard from a couple of questioners around the idea of the environmental standards. I would like to throw into here the Hackett review as well, which is also looking at a sense of an integrated building. So we've got a very disintegrated industry, and one of the findings of the Hackett, the key findings of the Hackett review, was you needed an integrated approach both to the production of the building and its final sign-off. Mm-hmm. So is that one way, for example, of driving the private sector to integrate harder? So what are the drivers that government has and currently isn't using that can start to use to create that world?
You start, Fergus, and then I'll continue.
Okay. We have been, ever since the unfortunate Grenfell Tower fire last year, and during the process of developing the sector deal, been taking account of the likely findings of the Hackett review and the interim report that was published in December last year, which identified a number of serious failings in terms of both the construction sector and the way it goes about commissioning, completing jobs. Also the failures of the people responsible for actually managing the overall system for ensuring building safety, which in theory is supposed to work, but in practice clearly didn't work properly. So we have been taking account of the recommendation and looking at what it is the activities that we're proposing to undertake through the sector deal can do to contribute to the wider objective of ensuring building safety in the UK. And there are some very obvious areas where the objectives are aligned. I think the greater use of digital technologies in relation to the design of buildings and the management of the construction phase will actually make it easier not only to design safe buildings that incorporate safe materials, but also to ensure that there is better control of the change process within the construction. You've got a manual for the building afterwards, yes. And you will be able to hand over to the ultimate client or building owner a detailed digital model that tells them exactly what is in the building, what's been done to it, and then if they wish to plan further work and make further amendments to the building, that will be similarly recorded. So everybody, and that in theory includes the emergency services, the local authority and any other relevant regulators, will have access to a comprehensive data set, which, if you continue to build buildings this way over time, you build up a very detailed picture of the urban environment and the built assets within it.
Yeah, I would add to that by saying that I've seen myself how fragmented the whole process is. I mean, some of it's to do with the fact just the way history evolved. We've got buildings, and well, we're in one that's about 5 different ages of buildings in one, effectively in one complex. And I think that we are, I mean, when I used to be in the hotel business, you'd buy a hotel, no one had any idea what it was built of, you know, what the likely, you'd have to, because of inspections, you'd obviously have to have, you could have health and safety reports, you could have fire reports and different things like that, but it was very fragmented and it was all kind of catching up from the past. But now with the construction sector changing as it is, we have got a chance to make sure that in future that every owner from the company or government, whatever, who buys the land and builds the building, all the way through its whole lifespan, has access to the same information. So much easier, as you've said, Fergus, because it's digitally based.
So do you think this will drive off-site manufacturing?
I think it will, because it's so much easier to control rather than using 20 or 30 different subcontractors, all of whom might be doing a job properly, but they're not paid to have a big picture at all. You know, of the overall construction. I think it will. I think it's inevitable. It will. And I think it's absolutely right. It should.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Lord Hunt. This is the question. How are the government ensuring the necessary training is available to provide the skills needed for off-site construction and other modern methods of construction? I mean, the point you were just making, of course, was the skills also needed for this digital management of houses. And can I just sort of apropos of this? So one of the ways in which companies can learn, as we heard from the previous speakers this afternoon, is by taking as an example other buildings that have been put up. And so somebody from the Sellafield was using their buildings, borrowing buildings from designer buildings from adjacent local authorities, not having to go through some formal judging procedure, and that seems to me very important too.
I think it does. But the core point is that the skills that the industry needs are changing dramatically, and the government's working with the Construction Industry Training Board and the industry generally to try and analyse what skills are needed for the future, and it's very different from mainstream building now. You know, digital skills are obvious, but it's not just to do with the actual construction itself. There's the design, logistics, site management. And in the same way that visiting, I can just pick out so many different sectors of the economy. For example, car factories. You know, I visited Cowley near Oxford twice in my life, once when I was 18 and once a few weeks ago. It's completely different. The people are building cars. Most of the people are trained to use some form of computer, what was a completely manual task. The whole system is based on everything other than physical labour. Well, building sites in that period haven't changed very much at all. The skills, the core skills of bricklaying, plumbing, being an electrician, etc., which very much divided skills, are still being trained to this day. Well, it will have to change. So how is government going to kickstart it? One way will be what we've been talking about this presumption of building off-site, because clearly it's very different sort of skills. The successful application of the apprenticeship levy, of which there have been some problems, not in the actual levy itself, which generally seems to be supported, but in its implementation, where there were 100 different standards that were all over the place. Now the government's looking through Jerry Berrigan and the Institute of Apprentices for standards that really will reflect what building industry needs in the future. And there's got to be a vision. There's got to be a way of things changing in the same way that, well, I explained the car, just to use one example, the way cars are manufactured is fundamentally different. I mean, it will change again, but the modular construction, things require totally different skills. So government can kickstart it in two ways. One is working with the industry over the skills, which I have explained, and the second way, of course, comes back to government using its forceful, well, its money to push these kind of things through, because it is for the benefit of everyone. Because we can't allow a situation, again, every time the economy expands, and of course everything is cyclical. Those, people like myself at my age, we've seen at least 2 or 3 different economic cycles. They always happen one way or the other, whatever governments and prime ministers might say, or fund managers for that matter. And we always have this problem of skills shortages when we go up the economic cycle. Well, hopefully now we're in a position so that things change, that will not happen. And I think the skills part of it is critical. And I think construction, rather than being its perception of being an old-fashioned traditional industry, will change dramatically to be, I can't say it's going to be as as glamorous as iPhones and iPads and things, but I think it will be fundamentally different, and I think future generations will see the benefit of it.
Fox. You brought up the subject of apprenticeships, and we actually heard from the previous panel that one of the issues currently facing firms is that the length of their contracts in many cases is less than the time it takes to complete an apprenticeship. And so there's two conclusions from that. One is you try and produce a modular system of apprenticeships where people can move to different firms to complete their apprenticeship, and the other point is to try to drive a greater degree of certainty within the building industry that enables it to actually train its own people, because absolutely fundamental to the skills problem is that there's so much uncertainty that many firms are not investing for the long term because they don't actually know what the long term is. So there's a kind of chicken and egg thing going on here, and what's the government doing, if you like, to try and get some certainty into what we're doing?
Well, I think you're certainly right in that the current and very traditional model for construction's short term is based on project by project, usually for cash flow reasons. I mean, even, for example, some of the massive building sites around are phased, certainly in residential property, they're phased for reasons of cash flow. And it's got to change. And the skills bit is one of them. I mean, I visited in King's Cross, not in this life, but when I was David Cameron's apprenticeship advisor in 2011, which predated the levy, but I visited the construction industry, the apprenticeship centre. That's not exactly what it's called, but that's what it is, in King's Cross, where that was their problem. They were typically having 2-year contracts. Apprenticeships were 3 years or more. Well, the companies with more substance behind them and more vision, and I have to say at the time that included Curation, who were very good at apprenticeships. I mean, because at this centre I met apprentices from all different companies. They had a vision beyond a 2-year contract. Now, I know what happened, and I'm certainly not making light of it, but the bigger companies particularly, and government's got to help them with longer term contracts. There's no question about it. And local authorities have to, housing associations have to take a longer term vision, otherwise there will always be this skills problem. But I'm sure it's the same. For example, in another sector completely, I visited British Airways, I visited Airbus in North Wales, where they make the wings for the Airbus planes, but they can't predict the future beyond the orders that they've got. Well, in the same way that a construction company won't be able to predict exactly what it's going to do, but they've got to think more long term as well. And if they're investing a lot of money like the O'Rourke's are in these massive factories, they've got to say to their customers, who are predominantly but not exclusively government, we will basically be able to do you a better price if we're guaranteed 4 or 5 years' work, because that helps with the skills and everything else. It's got to change. It's so old-fashioned, putting every little bit out to tender and all different companies. Who should the top contractor be? The apprenticeship provider, or should it be some of whom are very small, 5 people? Many of these buildings, even in big contracts, people are paid by the day or by the square metre or whatever it might be. And I think this all has to change. Otherwise, we'll never get to grips with the skills end of it. And I think government's got to prime this.
Okay, Baroness Neville-Jones.
I wanted to just pursue this issue just for a moment. I mean, because one thing becomes fairly clear, that if you're going to have off-site manufacturing as a predominant element, the business model has to change.
Yes.
Because the amount of upfront capital that's involved at early stages is much greater than if you do something which is the traditional rather slow cash flow, and I can wait 3 or 4 years as the client, before I actually have to fork out anything significant. How are you going to turn all this round? I mean, what's the government's master plan? Can you marshal enough projects that you can guarantee a flow so that actually the companies themselves have got confidence that they will have a business flow, and how will you get the thing going in the first instance?
In short, it will require consistent pipeline of construction projects.
It doesn't the industry has to change. It seems to me that the public procurer has to change
but we have the power, because a quarter to a third of all construction is government funded one way or the other.
You have the power. Will you use it?
We have to. Why would we not use it, Baroness Neville-Jones?
Well, because it's a question of
no, but for example, I'm sorry, Baroness Morgan. Can I?
I was just adding to that, which is to say, you're showing great conviction, I think, Minister. You're really clear that it's got to change, and I suppose what we want to understand is it definitely going to change?
It's otherwise it will not. The off-site construction will not happen. Companies are not going to build what are effectively huge factories completely on spec. I mean, everything's on spec to some extent, using, for example, the Airbus thing, but they take a commercial view based on their likely orders. And government spending has got to reflect this. And by the way, I don't think it's just government spending. I'm sure, for example, in house building, the big house builders are also going to have to say, we will guarantee you 1,000 units in 3 months or whatever it is, because otherwise the capital expenditure will not happen. But the government has got the purchasing power to be able to do that. Now, Baroness Neville-Jones' point was, does government intend to use it? Well, unless it's pushed really hard, it won't happen. And that's why, going back to the 5 departments, we have to make sure it does happen. And the Treasury, they do see that. They may see it just for financial reasons. We see it as something broader than that, because I think it's just going to, as I say, it's going to fundamentally affect. It's almost like an industrial revolution happening again, in the same way that many of the industries before the Industrial Revolution happened, for example, weaving and spinning and things, but they were done in people's homes. Well, they moved to factories. Well, we've learnt all those lessons, and we have to make sure it changes. And unless we live in a different type of economy where the government does everything, some might want that, but if we live in a mixed economy, the only direct power we've got is to make sure the government, the taxpayers' money is used for that. And for financial and other reasons, it will happen. It's got to.
Okay. Lord Fox, do you still want to come in? Okay.
It's really pressing this point on cash flow, but looking at the private sector. The private sector developers have a model whereby money does not go out of the door in many cases till money has come in through the door for what they've built. Okay, this is asking them to make a substantial reversal of their cash flow model. How are you going to persuade them that it's in their interest to do that?
Well, I would disagree with the presumption that you're making, Lord Fox, because
were Lord Borwick here, he would be making that point, and he knows far better than I do about property development.
Yeah, he knows far more than I do as well. So but also, builders have a lot of cash flow issues now. So, for example, if Barratt's build an estate, they're not paid the money until they've finished constructing a house. So I don't think it's such a fundamental change. The difference goes into the cash flow, because at least Barratt's just pay the money up front, and the rest of it they pay all their subcontractors on contracts and things. So I think it's a change, but I don't think it's such a major change in financing. But financing is not our problem. They've got the security for it. They've got sales. They may have to change their model, but they'll have to change their models in many ways. One of the spin-offs, sorry, look.
You said there is a model, but can the government help? Let me give an example, as I understand it. In France, for instance, you buy your apartment, whatever. The government has legislated that at the third of the completion you pay a third of the price, at the half you pay half. So The construction industry always has a cash flow.
Yes, that is for properties that people buy have
Private
constructed
sector.
for them in the private sector.
Yes.
Well, there's many examples where that can happen here, particularly when building individual properties. But I agree, not en masse. I don't think it's a matter for legislation, but I think the construction industry is going to have to change its cash flow model. I mean, for example, this idea of companies funding a lot of their production on basically not paying creditors for, not paying their suppliers for 30, 60, 90, 120 days, all these retentions. I mean, all this has to change. I don't think that's the fundamental point in Lord Fox's question, but cash flow models do change.
But there are opportunities, for example, to encourage securitisation, so they could secure it in advance and use that as a cash flow float, and lots of other. So the government could play a role in kind of encouraging those things.
They could, and I also think institutions, when they understand this type of construction, will move into it a lot more. We're seeing now, for example, institutions involved. Well, Legal and General and others got involved in the construction of what was fairly primitive buy-to-lets, the institutionalisation of it, which obviously has significant cash flow effects because they don't get the money back for 10 or 20 years. I'm not exactly sure what the yields are, but a lengthy period. Well, many of those institutions are now saying, well, we'll move into actual production, if you like. We'll become the factory and the suppliers. So cash flow models do change. And institutional money will have to come in as an alternative to fairly primitive forms of funding which are used now, which is using clients' money in advance, using effectively suppliers' money, and using retentions and other things like that.
Financial people on your panel planning the future of the
We've plenty of them.
Financially.
But are they? Do they have are they pushing a coherent policy on this?
They are, but I think there's more to it than just the financial side. But we do have a lot of financial people. That will
be in the document we're going to get imminently.
Well, that's in the sector deal, which is broader than just off-site construction.
Okay, Lord Caker.
So I can't promise that, otherwise I will get accused of misleading this committee, which I have no intention of doing. Well, not if I can help it.
Come back to the Treasury's role in driving forward the 5 departments. What will be the trigger to actually make something happen, to really push this so that procurement by these 5 departments actually occurs in the way that you envisage?
My opinion, the Treasury is saying what's happening here.
But what will make the Treasury decide that this is they've got to say?
Well, if they see that the policy as laid out in the Chancellor's autumn budget statement is not happening, but we have to make sure it does happen. But in terms of an absolute trigger, 5%, 10%, 20%, I don't know, because we haven't got one.
Right.
And I think it would be wrong in the short term to have one. But this is a public thing. It would be total failure of policy if this does not happen. But I believe the financial pressures to do it are there as well. And in the end, as we discussed before with Baroness Morgan, those things in the end override everything else.
Baroness Young.
Minister, let's just focus on the housing sector, because the levers that government has in that sector are comparatively small. It's not a big investor in housing development anymore. It used to be, but it isn't anymore. But we do have this real opportunity with the housing targets and a major kind of dash for housing. So where do you see the leverage coming to influence particularly the speculative private sector builders of low-rise housing? Because that's where we seem to be least well developed. And is it wrong to say that it's actually in their interest not to find a way of building faster and building out sites quicker, because that means prices then drop, which isn't in their interests in view of the investment they've already made in land banks?
Baroness Young, if I could answer first in terms of the public sector. You did make the point that government doesn't have a direct influence, but it actually does through funding of housing associations, etc. I know we don't call it, it's not the terminology it used to be, it's not the direct expenditure, but again it comes back to, it's perfectly reasonable for government to say that if we are going to fund this project for this housing association, that is done in modular construction off-site. So I think there's more influence there than it would at first appear. And I think government has to use that quite ruthlessly. In terms of the private sector effectively going slow on this, I think you're probably right. I think management are used to a certain way of doing things. And, it's, for example, government can tell schools all they like that we need more apprentices, but the current management, i.e. the teachers, for perfectly good reason, because it's the way they were brought up and developed, try and say, no, it's better for children to go to university. Well, it may be that the current management in the private sector, because what they're used to is a whole lifetime in handing out these contracts to different types of components of a traditional construction site, that it takes time to change. But in the end, if a property developer sees that they can get a better deal for a better product at a lower price, they will do it. And they will do it, and they have every reason and influence to do it, because their building costs have gone up dramatically. And quite apart from the actual cost of it, there are big skill shortages on building sites. And as I go around, when you speak to people, the main thing they say they can't get the contractors, they can't get the labour. And don't suppose it's the business of this committee particularly to go into Brexit issues and general migration issues. But putting any principle of that one side, the fact is now there is a significant shortage of skilled labour, and this will push it. Because if I were one of the big developers and I have a choice between paying £150 or £170 per square foot for a fairly basic house in a conventional way, and there's a way of doing the same quality product for two-thirds of that, they're going to choose it. So I think it's more economic pressure than government pressure in the private sector.
So what is the government is there a government action to kickstart that process, help that process? Because obviously individual house builders, and the point that you've already raised about upfront investment in manufacturing facilities is could well be a blockage.
Well, yes, I think that I don't think it's a government policy in the private sector. I think it's if the government kickstarts predominantly in the public sector with the hospitals and all this kind of thing, but also through where it can control it, the housing associations being a classic example, but there's others as well, then I think the private sector will follow. At the moment, a typical housing association property is built exactly the same way as a private sector. Why shouldn't it? It's fundamentally the same product. Maybe a few different designs and things, but it's fundamentally the same product. So if one goes, the other will go. I think government's much better trying to kickstart and push where it has got direct financial control, albeit through an intermediary delivery organisation like a housing association, which, whilst it is independent in its legal standing and everything, in the end it's quite right that government should apply the conditionality to the money that it spends. That's why I'm seeing Homes England about it. We've got to push in every way we can. But it's not easy, and we cannot command the big house builders, you will build this way. But they've got shareholders, they've got pressures as well, and I'm sure as they see the costs of modular construction come down, they will go for it.
Okay. Lord Mayor, did you want?
Can I ask one question, Minister, about the role of your department in standards? Because a lot of what's being talked about here in off-site manufacture would very much be enhanced by more standardisation. And can you comment on that?
Would you like to have a go at that, Fergus?
When you say standardisation, do you mean standards in the sense of product and process standards, or in the sense of standard designs?
I think probably both, actually.
Okay. In relation to standardisation, BEIS as a department sponsors the British Standards Institution, so we oversee the framework by which standards are developed within the UK. In terms of some of the activities that we're doing, one strand of the Transforming Construction programme is going to be about the development of new performance standards for buildings that are manufactured off-site, and the associated production methodologies that are going to be used, so that people have assurances about the quality of the product that they're ultimately going to be buying. And we see that as part and parcel of having an effective innovation programme that leads to products that will be commercialised and adopted at large scale. In relation to the standardisation of designs, I mean, that is ultimately a question for the organisation that is actually either commissioning the project or undertaking the developmental work for a particular client.
If I could comment, if I may, just on the design element. I mean, at the moment, for residential house building, it's very much a standard product for cost reasons. We go to these estates. I mean, yes, there's design choice A, B, C, and D, but really it's the same product. I mean, there might be a different gable or a different type of window or something like that. Well, that will continue. People, I'm sure, will pay a premium price for a premium product, like they do with a suit or something like that. But by and large, the clever way, of course, with the computerized design is there's ways of making things look different. They're very good at this in America, where they build houses, and obviously they don't have the weather problems, but they can build a house from a piece of land to use it in 13 weeks in factories. But they look different. People think they've got endless choice, but they haven't really. It's just the things that are put on it. So I think we'll see a lot more of that, which of course helps modular factory-based construction. But then we get back to the whole question of does everybody want to be the same? And the house builders have successfully created an illusion in the past that people are buying different, where they're fundamentally buying the same. So I think it will be very much that, albeit built off-site.
But in terms of the components of the standardisation and that aspect of standardisation, that's something that the government presumably will want to drive, because the more that is happening, the more it will incentivise off-site manufacture.
I think the economics will do that. I think one of the advantages of the type of computer-aided design and production that we're talking about actually means there might be a bit more flexibility in the standards of the choice of different products. But in terms of the standards, as in safety standards and everything else, obviously government clearly has to be involved.
Lord Fox, quick one.
Different standard on waste. I think one of you mentioned that on-site building is responsible for a huge amount of waste, and that's essentially almost a subsidy of the process at the moment. So what are you doing to drive down the waste? And surely a serious financial penalty on waste would further drive you towards your goals of having more off-site manufacturing.
Oh, well, there is already the landfill tax, which I would have thought the construction,
which is clearly not deterring people from wasting a huge amount of what they take on site.
I think, as with all industries, it's not that the construction sector intentionally wastes this amount of product. I mean, the level of waste.
Well, no, that's the thing. It's the process. That's exactly why I'm asking
the intrinsic inefficiency of the process. The fact that people make errors on site, but hence the reason we want to move to digitally designed manufactured buildings, because it enables you to run much more efficient processes and minimise the waste.
But at the moment, they can economically use the inefficient process. So if it was less economic to be so inefficient, then they would perhaps be encouraged to be more efficient.
It's a fair point. I must say I'd not considered that, but it's a consequence that we have to watch for.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Harris, thank you very much indeed. You've been most informative. In fact, Minister, there is no doubt about your commitment to increase the level of off-site construction. Therefore, it makes me feel that our report is going to be well received by the government. But we look forward to your response.
I look forward to receiving it, Lord Patel, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you indeed for
Thank you.
We're off record.